Well, good morning, everybody, or sorry, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this episode of the Press Box. We are going to be covering today the special session that just happened earlier this week, and I'm going to hand it off to Alex Nitkin, our editor and City Hall reporter for the Daily Line.
Thank you, Don. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
That was Don Vincent, by the way, who is our publisher. I'm Alex Nitkin, editor and City Hall reporter at the Daily Line. We wanted to just put together this kind of quicker press box to go over the past week, the special session, break down what happened. I know I, for one, was having a hard time trying to follow all the twists and turns, which is why I'm very glad that we have our own Joel Ebert, our state legislative reporter, and joining us as a special guest, Amanda Vinicky of WTTW. Welcome, guys. How are you doing?
I'm good. TGIF.
Yes. Happy Friday, everyone. Happy pre-holiday weekend Friday. So jumping into this, we're mostly going to be talking about redistricting, obviously. We're going to try to give as thorough a update as we can on the energy bill, talk a little bit about what the heck happened with the ethics omnibus on Tuesday, and then just sort of take some questions, talk about what we're happening next. So jumping right into it, on redistricting, this was the purported purpose. It was the purpose of why the special session was called. Joel, we knew that Democratic lawmakers who were running this process called it to update the maps that they had already approved, to input this new census data that came in on August 12th. You were covering this flurry of committee meetings that the redistricting committees held in the couple days leading up to this. What was happening there? How was that timed around the release of the next draft of maps?
Yeah, so basically over the last week or so, you saw several meetings. I think it was as many as 6 or 7 total that began, just a couple of days before the new maps were dropped. And the idea was to engage, advocacy groups, residents, just to get their views on what they'd like to see in the latest maps. The one issue at the beginning of those hearings was that there were no new maps to react to. So it was largely just saying what you would like in theory, which was a continuation of themes that we heard from earlier in the year, right? Make sure that certain groups have representation when they don't. One of them being the Illinois Muslim Civic Coalition. You had concerns from Latino organizations that said we need to ensure that we are fully represented. Same thing with organizations worried about the African-American representation in the legislature. But then the maps dropped, late Monday, and it was just sort of a scramble to try and go through those and see how those compared to the previous version. And then hours later on Tuesday, before there were a vote on the House floor, we saw yet another map. So it was just this sort of fast turn of changes that were explained. If you want to say how, Amanda.
I guess I will take a crack at the initial question in terms of what was the prerogative of these meetings, and hate to play the cynic, but in enough years of covering Illinois politics, you've got to bring in a little bit of that at the very least. Was it to actually receive input, or was it CYA, cover your, well, I mean, we're not on broadcast, cover your butt? Was that what these hearings really were all about? And I think that many people would venture that that is in fact the case, given what you talked about, Joel, given that you didn't actually see the maps until just before they were voted on, let alone give the public an opportunity to weigh in on them. And it's not as if this was a surprise that that's something that the public wanted. They've been demanding it, frankly, for years, but at the very least, that has been a demand going back to the previous set of hearings leading up to the first maps that were just as the second revised version, again, needing to be revised because of the census data, but also because of legal reasons, because of pending litigation to try and bolster Democrats' case. So it wasn't a surprise that that's something that community organizations wanted, and they did not get it in the least.
Yeah, my next question, Amanda, I think a lot of us were wondering what was substantially different about these new maps that came out, and was anyone happy about them? Did anyone look at them and say, this is really an improvement?
I am still sort of looking through kind of one of the difficulties, of course, with having this dropped. You have people that are map making specialists that have had months, or at least in this case from the 12th, to specialize in this, and they have all these data programs. We're just sort of like, looking, and thank God for Google in a lot of ways, looking at that. So I think we're still figuring out really what is all that different. Sure, actually Republicans might not have reason to hate these relative to the first grouping, given that there are fewer primary matches between GOP current members of the Illinois House. And so that sort of takes some heat off the House Republicans a little bit. Advantage for them. But by and large, we have seen disappointment from the Muslim community, from the Latinx community, from the Black community, and go on down the list. There is a pastor who has been very vocal at a lot of these meetings from the Orthodox Jewish community. He's expressed disappointment. So I don't think really there is a whole lot of joy here. And despite, again, there being perhaps some reason actually for the Republicans to appreciate this set of maps more than the first one that was signed into law by the governor, they are still going forward with their lawsuit very much. As, by the way, I think we have to point out the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund continuing with a lawsuit in federal court contending that this violates some federal and frankly state laws that are supposed to really take into consideration the surging Latino population in Illinois. And they say, hey, wait a second, our population grew, but the number of majority Latinx communities did not. And I do think really briefly here, and then I'll toss it back to you, something to point out when we're talking about this, because I've had people say, hey, wait a second, they want to guarantee that there's a Latino representative elected. That's not what we're talking about here when we say, Latinx districts or Black districts. We're talking about a majority of voters, or at the very least a voting bloc that ensures that some of these populations that have previously been ignored have protections versus being split up so they can have a voice and a block in determining elected representation versus having that purposely diluted.
There's one extra thing I wanted to add on. You asked what the difference between the previous maps and this one is, and one issue that was resolved is the previous maps had districts that were just widely different, and largely because of the use of American Community Survey data in terms of population. This changed that, right? So in the court case, there was a hearing the next day after the maps passed with the federal lawsuits that are going. And you heard the attorneys on both the Republican side and MALDEF's side admit that the malapportionment issue, where there are a difference of tens to 20,000 populations between the district, that is no longer the case. So even the plaintiffs have conceded that is it's even, in a way, but there is still an argument to be made why certain groups were disadvantaged in these new maps.
Yeah, I want to get into the lawsuits a little bit more. First, I want to remind everyone, if you have any questions, I want to encourage everyone to type those out in the meeting chat. We had a couple come in already, and so we'll get to those, but we want to make sure that we can address anything that is left unsaid or anything that people are curious about. Joel, on those lawsuits, purported, you'd think that going into them or going into this redistricting, it would, like you said, take a lot of the wind out of the sails of those legal arguments, saying that they are, not in line with actual populations. At least MALDEF is still pretty unsatisfied with the result, right? And I'm curious to hear both your thoughts about this. Just where you see the lawsuits going from here. Do you think that they have really been substantially weakened by this new round, or does it seem like they are going to come back with more firepower than ever?
Well, it was interesting to listen to the hearing the other day with the federal judges and the attorneys on both the plaintiffs and the defense side. And essentially, again, the lawsuit, in a sense, was neutered on the malapportionment claim. That doesn't mean that the lawsuits are going to be tossed, though, in general. The question now becomes, are these maps, do they fairly distribute allocation to certain groups of influence. You have not only MALDEF saying that they don't like the current maps and they need more time to review the new maps. They also, you've seen the Latino Policy Forum, which has sort of been concerned but stopped short of filing a lawsuit. They recently called for the governor to veto them. So you definitely still see concerns right now. I think that the issue right now is a lot of people are still trying to understand what is the difference between the two maps. And that's the case with the attorneys on both sides. So under this discussion that we heard in federal court the other day, there's going to be, it sounds like a couple of weeks still to review this. There was initially supposed to be a trial scheduled for the end of September. That's likely not going to happen, with attorneys on both sides admitting we really need this resolved by January. So I would say between now and January, we will see some resolution to the case.
Yeah, go ahead, Amanda.
Oh, yeah, I was going to say, if I could jump in here, because I think Joel touched on a couple of really interesting points here. First with the court case and then also politically. So first, in terms of the question of the courts, I'm no attorney, so not willing to make any predictions there. But what is really interesting to me is the timing of all of this, because one of the reasons that the first set of maps was sort of rushed out using American Community Survey versus the census, despite widespread calls for that to not happen, is because of deadlines that are in the Constitution. And so those deadlines don't say, hey, we need a map by then. They say, we need a map that is done by this group or else. And so that's why Democrats went ahead and did it, because then they didn't have to either share power with Republicans in drafting a map, or if there wasn't any sort of cooperation agreement and compromise, risk giving in completely ceding control to Republicans, because eventually it would come to literally, drawing virtually a party name out of a hat. So what is interesting about this now is sort of that deadline has long since passed. So if the maps in any way are tossed, who gets the redo? What does this mean? Is it going to be, a judge that is doing this? Is it going to be an opportunity to throw it into the hands of a commission? Like, we don't know. This is all sort of new in terms of these particular arguments and these set of challenges and questions. And then further politically, despite saying I hate making predictions, I'm going to make one here. The governor is going to sign these. He is on board with this. That's sort of the whole program, the way that this operates. He did it the last time around. I suppose, well, I know talk about ethics soon. You could do a little something with an amendatory veto. That's not going to happen either. They need this to go. The governor's going to sign these despite that pressure. And it's just sort of interesting to watch, I think, because you have a lot of these very vocal advocates, particularly from groups such as the Latino Policy Forum, that would carry a lot of weight, typically in Springfield, particularly with the Latino caucus. And so watching sort of that play out and who has the power in Springfield and what went on, and I don't really have any great answers to this at this point in time, in terms of Latino representatives not clamoring for more majority Latino districts as they voted for, agreed to these maps. And in fact, you had Latinos heading up both the House and Senate redistricting committees. And then also this pressure on the governor, because of course he took this campaign pledge as a candidate that he would veto any map that was not drawn by an independent commission, that was instead drawn by legislators and sort of drawn by legislators or their appointees. And he already backed away from that by signing the first set of maps. I don't think this call for a veto by the Latino Policy Forum is going to change his mind, but nor perhaps will it really hurt him as he's facing re-election, because we've been talking about this for I don't know how many minutes now. This stuff is complicated. It's not really what draws the ire of your average voter. It does, however, get the attention of people who are really involved in Springfield politics and know that this sort of seemingly arcane stuff really does matter in terms of who's making decisions down the line.
Absolutely. Before we move on to talking about the energy legislation, Jenny wrote in with a couple of questions. Number one, which priorities were weighed in the decision-making process? Number two, who was represented at the table and who was not? Number three, I think this is the biggest one of all. What are the implications of the composition of the legislature for the composition of the legislature for the next 10 years? That last one is really the question underlying this entire process. Joel or Amanda, any thoughts on any of those, particularly that last one as we're looking forward to the next decade?
I mean, I think on the next decade, you could look at the last maps, right? And people point to the idea of how many incumbents didn't face a challenger and how many won re-election immediately afterwards. One would imagine that will be a similar process that happens here in the next couple of or in the next year. There are obviously some Republicans who are challenging or could potentially face challenges of one another. That will lead to some changes, but there are very few Democrat incumbents facing another Democrat incumbent. So I would think that these are going to lead to very similar outcomes right now to what the makeup of the legislature is. That's the idea of the Democratic majority writing maps that favor them. That is a political calculation, right? And as far as the other two questions, I don't know if you want to weigh in, Amanda.
Yeah, I would say, well, first question, who was at the table? Democrats were at the table, period, the end. There were hearings, anybody and everybody could weigh in on it, but who was at the table, who was drawing these people that were hired by Democratic legislators to ... as Joel just said, draw maps that were in the party's favor. And so, yes, who knows what will happen politically? I think there are a lot of people that, go back a decade and they would say, wait, president is going to be Donald Trump. I mean, you can't predict really these things outright. However, what you can do is look at past voting behavior, past election results, and given that, yes, most certainly this is a map drawn to increase representation by Democrats who already hold super majorities in both chambers of the General Assembly to bolster that even more. And sort of an aside here, as you're drawing maps that favor one party or the other, there's sort of this other argument in terms of how that has changed the political discourse, and that you're going to get people that operate more on the extremes versus the moderate margins, because and that's where you're seeing things like in downstate where there used to be Democrats able to win elections and going toe to toe. No, those are all Republicans, and it's fairly conservative Republicans as well. And the maps are drawn with that design because any of the voters that say would be maybe more moderate or go back and forth between voting blue or red, they're drawn into a map where that will into a district to help Democrats. So it changes what happens in Springfield and what these parties look like. And frankly, I forget the question number two. So sorry.
You know what? I think we got to move on anyway. But that was a great drilling down into those. And thank you for the questions, Jenny. The energy bill, clearly this is a very long saga. I want to start by asking you, Amanda, to just set things up for us the way that where this legislation stood going into this week. There was some uncertainty over whether anything would get done on it at all in the special session or around the special session, right?
There was some question because there was no deal going in, and lo and behold, there wasn't a deal coming out of it either. And so this has been a long-running debate. I sometimes struggle when I'm writing my stories. Do I say, there have been negotiations for months, when really this is something that has legitimately, like no exaggeration, been going on for years. The current arguments perhaps are somewhat newer, and that is the crux of issues regarding Prairie State Energy Campus in Marissa, Illinois. That sort of percolated in the past couple of months, but Illinois has known for quite some time that it wasn't hitting its targets to move to clean and renewable energy, and that there was a massive problem with the solar energy incentives that had previously been signed into law. And so, and further, Exelon has been warning for quite some time that we want more money from Illinois ratepayers, or we're going to shut down nuclear plants due to changing dynamics in the energy markets. So going into the legislation, like I said, there really was no deal, despite Senate Democrats really and President Don Harmon trying to push one through.
Yeah, Joel, Amanda mentioned the Prairie State Energy Campus, which I remember was a huge sticking point that arguably is a big part of what hobbled the bill in the spring. We saw that Senator Hastings tried this week to come out with a bill to sort of bridge that conflict. What did legislators, and particularly in the Senate, do to try to smooth over that particular sticking point?
Yes, so initially, again, the idea was this Prairie State is one of the largest polluters in the country. So you had environmental organizations arguing, well, we can't have an energy and climate change bill without addressing this, right? So the whole discussion on Prairie State ended up landing on completely closing it by 2045. That led to some one would say possibly lukewarm support from environmental groups, but at least got them to agree to this version of the bill for the Senate. Will it stay that way? Based off of some public sentiment that's already been shared by some organizations, you've seen folks say that, no, we got to put in more steps in the process. We can't just stop at that 2045 closure. A lot can happen between now and then. It doesn't look like that may be the final version of this. A lot of this remains up in the air. We haven't heard explicitly from folks in the House what are the demands that we must meet in order to make this go through. All the work in the past few months has largely taken place either behind closed doors or in the Senate discussions. Now we will begin to see some of those, hopefully, public discussions that go on in the House, but the clock is certainly ticking.
Yeah, backing up just a little bit here, Amanda, can you walk us through what exactly happened with the legislation on Monday and Tuesday? There was a bill that it seemed like more people were coming on board with, and then suddenly the governor throws a wrench into things, something passes at 1 a.m. Can you what was the sort of the sequence of events here?
So you had legislature back in Springfield. Again, the real point was to get done with this maps, but while they're there, how are you not going to take a crack at it? Because that deadline really is coming. Exelon saying that it will at least begin to deactivate one of the nuclear generators at its Byron plant starting September 13th. So not that far away. And again, there already has been sort of a breakdown of what had been a nascent but beginning to soar solar industry. That's already occurred. Really, though, the big pressure here is the nukes because of all of the jobs, and also because, of course, nuclear energy is considered clean. There are certainly opponents to relying on this who consider it, dangerous, but others who say, hey, wait, if you're looking for something that's carbon free, nuclear is it, and you already have existing plants that we don't want them to retire prematurely. If we want them around, they need money. At least that's, again, the contention of Exelon. So when in Springfield, you had one proposal go before a Senate committee, and then it took a while to get there. That was stalled. Then you had very late night / early morning, the Senate actually approve a package, which is farther than anything has gotten to this point. But what that legislation does, again, is sets a 2045 closure date, which had been a very big demand of Governor Pritzker and environmentalists for this Prairie State Energy Campus. But it didn't include, as Joel indicated, those sort of ramp ups. So I think that's going to be one of the key negotiating points going forward, because we hear from Pritzker, he sort of has added in some additional demands dealing with unions, what he calls fixes. Clearly, he wants in on this, but I think what I'm really going to be watching is, will there be emissions caps on Prairie State and, frankly, CWLP in Springfield as well, leading up to that 2045 date or not? That's something that environmentalists clearly really want. But Prairie State, and when we say that, yes, they have power, but I'm saying in a power battle, but really we're talking about unions here who don't want this plant to have to go offline or lose any jobs. They want to hang on to them as long as possible. They contend, all right, if you're going to have us both close the campus early, but also then we have to meet these caps, there's no way for that to be something that they can financially deal with. So that's really, I think, where things are going to stand at a negotiating point going forward, the really big hindrance. And so when I see there was a question, who are the Democratic leaders holding things up? This is an issue where it's not strictly partisan. A lot of this is regional. If you have, for example, one of these nuclear generators in your district, you're going to be fighting for those jobs. You're going to be on Exelon's side, even if you might not otherwise be, for example. This isn't strictly partisan. And one of the difficulties here is, I think, certainly personality can play a part of it, given that Pritzker and Harman aren't besties. For example, you have new leadership. This is very, very, very complex. Mike Madigan had served on the Illinois Commerce Commission, so not only was he Madigan as speaker, that really was somebody who, cut a deal, and that was what he was known for. And you hear some people say, gosh, kind of miss the guy and things like this. He also knew energy inside and out. And so that's a complication. But really what it is that you have two groups that Democrats are typically aligned with and typically don't have facing off against one another in labor and environment. And they are disagreeing on this one, and that's really the holdup.
Right. So going forward, it looks like the legislature, and particularly the House, if it's going to take this up, have some rapidly approaching deadlines that they have to take into account. Number one, Amanda, you mentioned the Exelon threatened to close its plants by the 13th. There is also this solar cliff when solar subsidies are poised to run out. And there is also, on more technical grounds, a legislative deadline that the House would have to take this up by, right, Joel?
I'm sorry, Alex, I didn't hear the end of that question.
That there's also that the House only has a certain number of days to concur with this legislation.
No, they can drag.
Or am I mixing that up with something else?
Yeah, I think you're confusing that with the veto decision on the ethics bill, which if you want to transition to that,
we'll get there. So I guess the question remains, which is, what is the time pressure that they're under here? And does it seem like they're really feeling that?
I mean, yeah, there's been a time crunch for months. Everybody's acknowledged that, right? And I think that's only going to get worse as that window of the middle of September starts to close. If those facilities start decommissioning, you're going to see the outcry reach a different level, right? Because the issue is, if these workers start getting laid off, then what happens, right? Then there could be some people forecast an immediate economic effect of not only jobs lost, but potentially leading to let's go the drastic scenario of brownouts and blackouts like Texas, right? That's probably not going to immediately occur, but the pressure happens if there are less facilities on the utility system to sustain the current level of output that we have, right? So I think that is a very real time crunch that will put lawmakers in a bind right now to kind of get things done in the next 10 days, which seems like kind of, whoa, that's an insane amount of time, but we'll see what happens.
Yeah, Amanda, any last word on energy before we move on to the ethics bill?
I will try to keep this brief. I would add that sort of why this deadline, because again, sometimes deadlines can get pretty fuzzy, but this, I think, is a hard one, at least if you believe Exelon, because it's, it was cool. I got to do a story on this and, tour the Byron plant and sort of ask that question. Okay, so you say you're going to close down. All right, what if legislation passes the next day after you close on September 13th? Can't you just fudge it a little bit? And they say the answer to that is no, because it is really, I mean, this is literally nuclear energy, right? And so they have to reorder fuel rods. It has to do with that. They say once they shut down, no, there really isn't an easy mechanism, hasn't been done before, to sort of flip the switch back on. And so that is why this is a very real deadline. And generally, I think you would say the General Assembly, I can't say it does its best work, because I'm not going to say it's necessarily good what they do, but they do the most work when they are at deadline time with that pressure.
They
so
work faster.
maybe this is, there we go. So perhaps this is what will get something going. But given just how intractable the differences have been thus far, and given how prolonged this battle has been, there are some, I think, that are truly questioning whether this will get done and what that will mean both for nuclear jobs as well as for Illinois' commitment to, or ability to, reduce carbon emissions, both and it's just sort of because, of course, carbon emissions aren't something Illinois can take measures, but as Joel indicated, one of these things is if you shut down and then you import energy from other states that are still reliant on coal-fired plants, what are you really doing in terms of impacting climate change? Climate change doesn't really know state borders.
So moving on to this ethics bill, Joel, unlike I think the energy bill, things were a lot fuzzier. Going into this week, there was not a whole lot of suspense about the governor's position on, well, he had signed a mandatory veto on the ethics legislation. He had basically now given the General Assembly some clear instructions to come back and pass this. Could you, it seemed like there was not a whole lot of mystery or suspense about the ethics bill going into this week, right? About what would happen with it.
No, there really wasn't supposed to be. There was a very narrow amendatory veto that the governor had that everybody just kind of acknowledged, like, yeah, I guess he's right. Maybe we did miss that provision in it. And it was really just kind of reducing or confusing the clarity around the executive branch, really. The central goal of the legislation remained intact. To shore up the state's, ethics laws in various ways, right? This was a hotly contested issue for the last 2 years that led to this bill that wasn't fully supported and had nuance, right? You had some organizations like Reform for Illinois who were saying this didn't go far enough. You had some Republicans in the House say the same exact thing. You had Legislative Inspector General Carol Pope recently come out and announce her resignation and say that this bill really indicated that the legislature doesn't take this issue, ethics being the issue, seriously. But by and large, the legislation was overwhelmingly supported when it was voted on earlier this year. So you thought maybe with an amendatory veto, they would just pass it really quick. That happened in the Senate. There was no debate, no contention. It was unanimously agreed upon. Then you get over to the House, and there was some discussion and debate, and it was really the second to last thing that they were working on after a very long day that was supposed to begin at noon and went till 10 plus hours later. And you had Representative Kelly Burt talk about this issue, say really just agree upon this. Republicans pushed back. The next thing you know, she pulled back the vote on the bill, and it was really unclear why. They voted on another amendatory veto, or another veto of the governor's, I believe, and came back with the bill, voted on it, and it fell short of the numbers that were needed to approve it, sending it back into limbo land.
Now, Amanda, did this signal a real disagreement over the bill, or was it just someone hadn't counted correctly the number of people who were in the room?
I'd say that it's actually a combination of both. And by the way, I really love the term limbo land. But I think it was both. It was number one, that yes, this vote came late in the night. And so by then some legislators, they got out. They went home. And so Democrats were not at full attendance. So they didn't have their full numbers. And then I think what you also saw was frustration that Republicans had about this measure going in, they voted along with it, but sort of, through clenched teeth when they went along with it in the first place, because they had said that it didn't go far enough, that given Illinois' corruption scandals, true ethics, quote unquote, reform is needed, and that this was not it. And they were, I think that argument, again, you don't try and get partisan, but it wasn't just Republicans in this case. That was bolstered by a lot of the good government groups, things like the Campaign for Political Reform, and also the legislative inspector general herself, who really resigned over this, saying that the legislation that was sent to Governor Pritzker showed that the General Assembly was not, in fact, taking ethics seriously. So this measure did make some changes that could potentially be profound. For example, making legislators declare more on their economic interest statements so we can see if there's conflict of interest, things like along those lines. But still a revolving door for legislators who legislate one day and then can go and be a lobby their former peers the next day. There's still sort of an opportunity for that within this. And that's where you had these good government groups calling for the governor to use his amendatory veto powers to do more. And so that's really where the pushback came, I think, was Republicans who, by the way, again, super minority votes wouldn't normally be needed, but Democrats had already left. So that's where they voted no, because they said, hey, wait, Governor, you used your mandatory veto pen to do this when you could have / should have, in their opinion, done so much more. The joke in the end may, however, be on Republicans, because now you have them voting against an ethics measure, and that, of course, can provide fodder in the 22 elections, because it certainly doesn't look good. There are lots of ways to spin this on both sides, but it doesn't look good, perhaps, to vote against an ethics bill. I will say that while it's in limbo land now, presumably, the legislature will come back, will vote on this. There's another clock ticking. This is where you were talking about that timeline. They had 14 days from when this was read into the record. They'll be coming back anyway, ostensibly for a last pass at energy, and enough Democrats should be there that this will become law and just sort of a blip. The governor can then campaign and say, hey, I signed this big ethics law into statute. You're welcome, Illinois.
Yeah, Joel, a lot of those critics of this bill from the advocacy groups and among Republicans might look at this voting snafu that happened on Tuesday and say, great, this opens the door for us to go in and make more substantial changes to the bill, strengthen it. How likely is that to happen at all? Or is it just going to be a come back in real quick and, clean up on aisle house?
I mean, it really depends, right? So if they don't get this done within the 15-day time period that is required, then the bill dies. Right now, it isn't dead. It can still come back. You can have a second vote on it. The Democrats can prevail if they have the required votes, right? If it dies on the branch, you've heard already calls from Republicans say use veto session, which is coming up, in which there aren't many vetoes so far, to seriously work on a really comprehensive package. If you talk to the advocacy groups, though, I would venture a guess that they would be skeptical that something could happen because of the way that this package came out. So when it came out last year, we initially saw it in the lame duck session introduced, and there was no involvement with advocacy groups, despite them having hearings and trying to add their input. They didn't have any part in writing this legislation. They were confused and flabbergasted about certain provisions in it, just like Carol Pope was about this latest version of the bill. And so the question is, if you hit the reset button, try and do it over again in the October veto session or in January, will it have any true involvement with the advocacy groups and others? One might say, look at, the past is prologue. We'll see.
All right, so before we wrap up here, I want to just quickly run through that other veto work that remains outstanding for the General Assembly and the veto action that they took, the other veto action that they took, including what I believe is the first override of this of a veto by Governor Pritzker. or at least they overwhelmingly overrode second. Okay, tell me, this was a bill related to how ambulance calls are reimbursed. Is that right?
Yeah, it's really kind of some pretty complicated stuff, truth be told, but it was just interesting to watch the walloping that Pritzker got. It is really difficult to summarize. Basically, you have private ambulance companies. They say that they have to go through billing for non-emergency rides for Medicaid patients. They have to go through these managed care organizations that sort of are the middleman between healthcare providers like private ambulance companies and the state for folks that are on state, for low-income individuals that are on state-backed health insurance. And so they wanted to be able instead to bill directly to the state. And they say that that will help them with a shortage of EMTs, because of course there's hiring shortages all over the place, including with that. They say that that's hurting care. The governor said that this workaround with billing would actually hurt care. So again, kind of some complicated stuff that I don't think would normally really rise to the level of getting much attention, other than you don't see a whole ton of vetoes that aren't done in coordination with the legislative leaders, because of course Pritzker is a Democrat. As we've said multiple times here, Democrats rule the roost in the House and the Senate. So typically this is sort of a coordinated thing. Like even the governor's ethics veto, that was surely done with a heads up to the Democratic leaders, and it was the absentee issue versus the material issue that caused this standoff or sort of leading it to limbo land. In this case, though, I mean, it was nearly unanimous. I think one Democrat voted with the governor on this, and so I
Do you remember
don't think
who that was?
it's
Mary Flowers.
yeah, who always, not always, but frequently has her own take on matters. So it's just, I don't think this is going to be a sign of true friction between the governor and the legislature. There's always a little bit of that percolating, but this isn't a big sign of it. It was nonetheless really pretty stunning.
Joel, can you walk us through some of the other vetoes or other bills that the General Assembly has to take action on in this limited time window, I guess, that they've opened for themselves?
Oh, Alex, you're putting me under pressure, and I didn't write down those. There was one that they agreed on. I want to say
it was a lot of pretty obscure.
There were,
stuff.
and
So
from
we
what
don't
I
need to
recall,
necessarily catalog all those.
from what I recall, Amanda, there weren't. I think they voted on one other veto, and the other ones they just left, really. So I think they're pretty much. I want to say it was like 3 or 4 full vetoes, and 3 of those I believe will stand, but I could be wrong on that exact number.
I really don't think there's much, and some of these vetoes are like because something else already passed that does a similar thing. You have 2 versions of a bill, or again, I think a lot of this is coordinated.
Technical
Veto
stuff.
session is not going to be necessarily used in as it traditionally is supposed to be, or at least by its name. It's not going to be a session for vetoes. It'll be a time for new legislation, and I'm guessing we can kind of circle back. I'm going to make a prediction here that it'll get back to what we were first talking about. Redistricting, more of that, but this time focused, on Congress.
Yeah, I mean, let's end it there. Joel, as we get into veto session, what are you going to be watching the most closely?
Largely congressional maps, right? So we had Senate President Don Harmon definitively say the other day, those are coming in October. So, that will be the big issue. So far, we have not seen a single thing on the congressional maps. A lot of people anticipate, Democrats again trying to bolster their numbers, try and reduce the size of the GOP representation. Some people anticipate a couple of folks being, directly having their maps affected, which might lead to some members of the Republican side of Congress running for other offices. But we'll really see.
Amanda, any last thoughts you want to leave us with? Things that you're going to be looking forward to or looking at closely for the rest of 2021?
I'm for sure with Joel, who will be watching, of course, most most immediately what is going to go on with energy, following that, the results of whatever goes on in court with the state legislative maps, most certainly, yes, these congressional maps, because of what that means, frankly, for control in Washington of Congress. Illinois could play a big part in that. And of course, Illinois losing a seat of its congressional delegation. So even outside of the power plays, there was going to be a new map there. And then also, I mean, constantly, you've got to be watching the budget. There's still a whole lot of that ARPA money left and a lot of claims, desires, and polls on how that will be used. So I will be watching to see what happens then in veto session. And again, a lot can happen in a couple of months. So we'll see what rises to the top and what gets on General Assembly members' plates before then, particularly as you're having people, because of the delayed a primary election, figure out what offices they're going to be run for. So who else might join the GOP primary to try to get control from, presumably, of course, Democratic nominee Pritzker of the governor's mansion?
Right. Well, we're going to close things off there unless anyone has any last questions that they want to throw into the meeting chat. If not, Joel Ebert, our state legislative reporter, and special guest Amanda Vinicky from WTTW, thank you so much for taking all this time and joining us. I know I learned a lot from this conversation. I hope that everyone else watching did too. I'm Alex Nitkin. I'll turn things back over to Don now.
Thanks so much, Alex. Amanda, thank you for your time. This was really insightful. Joel, as always, thank you for your guys' comments and insights into what broke down all last week, or this past week, excuse me. A couple of quick housekeeping items. This recording will be up on the site by the end of the day, so if you didn't catch the beginning of it and want to recap or share it with your friends and colleagues, you can find that at thedailyline.com/pressbox. Just after the Labor Day holiday, you will also get notifications about our third quarter Chicago Index survey is going to be launching. So if you haven't participated in that before, please do so. If you have, we'd love to have you back again for another quarter to get your opinions on what's going on in the city of Chicago and around the state. So you can learn more there by going to thechicagoindex.com. But until then, have a happy holiday, Labor Day weekend, and enjoy the great weather. It's going to be getting cold soon, so get out there while you can. Not too soon. All right, everybody. Thanks so much.
Happy 3-day weekend.